The loudest laugh in a courtroom is often the one that dies first. On a gray Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago, Courtroom 6B carried the familiar rhythm of whispered conversations, shuffling case files, and polished shoes crossing marble floors. But beneath the ordinary routine lingered an uneasy tension that no one could quite explain. Every bench was nearly full. Reporters quietly adjusted their notebooks. Attorneys exchanged careful glances. Deputies stood along the walls with practiced confidence. At the center of it all sat a black woman in a simple navy suit, her hands resting calmly on the table, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. Victoria Brooks neither looked nervous nor angry. She simply waited. Across the room, Officer Ryan Mercer leaned comfortably against the rail with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed he understood exactly how the day would end. His polished badge reflected the courtroom lights as he exchanged amused looks with another officer before letting out a quiet chuckle that echoed farther than he intended. When Victoria calmly reached for a document on the table, Ryan smiled even wider. "Guess someone finally figured out paperwork," he muttered just loudly enough for nearby spectators to hear. A few people shifted awkwardly. One man lowered his eyes. Another forced an uncomfortable smile before looking away. Victoria offered no response. She did not roll her eyes. She did not defend herself. She simply placed the document back onto the table with measured precision, as though every movement had already been rehearsed long before anyone entered the courtroom. Ryan interpreted her silence as surrender. He straightened his uniform and folded his arms, wearing the satisfied grin of a man convinced he had already won an argument that had barely begun. What he failed to notice was that Judge Eleanor Whitmore had quietly looked up from the case file the moment Victoria entered the room. It was not the casual glance judges gave every participant. It was longer, more deliberate, almost familiar. The judge quickly lowered her eyes again before anyone else seemed to notice. The bailiff announced the opening of the session, and everyone rose before taking their seats once more. The atmosphere settled, yet something invisible continued to pull at the edges of the room. Reporters who had expected an ordinary hearing suddenly found themselves paying closer attention. One clerk discreetly reread the case file. A prosecutor frowned after noticing a notation attached to Victoria's name, then immediately closed the folder without saying a word. Ryan remained completely unaware. He laughed again under his breath, convinced that the quiet woman sitting across the room was simply another witness who would soon disappear into the endless stream of courthouse visitors. He never considered that silence could be stronger than pride. He never imagined that confidence without humility often blinds people to the truth, standing only a few feet away. Victoria finally lifted her eyes, not toward Ryan, but toward the bench. Her expression remained calm, almost compassionate, as though she already understood how the next hour would change more than one life. Somewhere in the back row, an older reporter whispered, "Something feels different today." No one answered. Even the air inside the courtroom seemed to pause. And while Officer Ryan Mercer continued wearing the smile of a man certain he controlled the room, the judge quietly rested one hand on the file before her, took a slow breath, and looked toward Victoria one more time with a respect that no one else had yet begun to understand. The clerk cleared her throat before quietly sliding another folder onto the judge's bench, and although the movement lasted only a second, Judge Eleanor Whitmore paused just long enough for the silence to become noticeable. Most people dismissed it as routine. Victoria Brooks noticed it immediately, but her expression never changed. She folded her hands again and calmly waited. Officer Ryan Mercer, however, saw only another opportunity to entertain himself. He leaned toward the deputy standing beside him and whispered, "She looks like she practiced that serious face in the mirror." A faint laugh escaped before the deputy quickly looked away, clearly uncomfortable. Ryan mistook that discomfort for agreement. He believed everyone in the room shared his opinion, when in reality many had simply learned that remaining silent was easier than challenging someone wearing a badge. The court reporter adjusted the recording equipment while attorneys quietly organized stacks of documents. Every sound seemed unusually sharp. The click of a pen echoed. A chair gently scraped against the polished floor. Somewhere near the gallery, a cell phone vibrated before being silenced. Victoria remained perfectly still through it all, her attention fixed on the bench rather than on the officer determined to provoke her. She had heard comments like his before. She understood that dignity was often mistaken for weakness by people who measured strength only through volume. Judge Whitmore finally opened the newest folder. Her eyes moved carefully across several pages before stopping at a single line. Without lifting her head, she asked the clerk in a calm voice, "Was this supplemental filing received this morning?" The clerk nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. It arrived shortly after 8 o'clock." The judge acknowledged the answer with the slightest movement before closing the folder halfway. That brief exchange lasted only moments, yet it changed the atmosphere inside the courtroom. Daniel Hayes, the prosecutor, noticed it as well. He glanced toward Victoria with growing curiosity, then quietly reviewed his own notes once more. Even defense attorney Michael Carter appeared confused by something he had just read. Ryan remained blissfully unaware. To him, the hearing was still a simple matter involving someone he had already decided was unimportant. He straightened his tie and smiled with the confidence of a man who believed appearances always revealed the whole truth. In the gallery, veteran reporter Emily Foster quietly scribbled one sentence across the top of her notebook. Why is everyone suddenly rereading the file? Years covering federal courthouses had taught her to recognize invisible shifts before dramatic moments arrived. Experienced people rarely looked nervous without a reason. She watched Victoria carefully. There was no trembling hand, no anxious glance toward the exit, no whispered consultation with an attorney. Instead, there was remarkable patience, the kind carried by someone who had no need to prove anything because the facts would eventually speak for themselves. Ryan noticed Emily watching and interpreted her attention as interest in him. He adjusted his uniform once more, unaware that the focus of the room had quietly drifted elsewhere. Judge Whitmore closed the folder completely and rested both hands upon it. Her expression remained professional, but there was unmistakable respect in the way she looked toward Victoria for just a heartbeat before addressing the courtroom. No one else understood that silent exchange. Not yet, but one by one, the people inside Courtroom 6B were beginning to realize that the quiet woman everyone had overlooked might be the only person in the room who knew exactly how the day was going to end. Judge Eleanor Whitmore allowed the silence to linger for several more seconds before formally opening the hearing, and the stillness inside Courtroom 6B settled over every seat like a heavy curtain. The attorneys acknowledged the court, the clerk confirmed the docket, and the first procedural statements were delivered with calm precision. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary, yet the quiet tension continued to grow beneath the surface. Officer Ryan Mercer interpreted that tension as anticipation for his testimony. He squared his shoulders, adjusted the collar of his uniform, and wore the confident smile of a man convinced that every word he spoke would be accepted without question. He glanced toward Victoria Brooks once more and shook his head with open amusement. "You should have brought someone who knows how these hearings work," he said in a voice just loud enough for nearby spectators to hear. Several people lowered their eyes instead of responding. Victoria simply looked forward. Her breathing remained slow and even, untouched by his remarks. The absence of a reaction only encouraged Ryan further. To him, silence meant defeat. He had never considered that silence could also be discipline. Emily Foster quietly observed the exchange while writing another note in the margin of her notebook. She had spent years covering federal courts, and she recognized a familiar pattern. The loudest person in the room was often the one paying the least attention. Daniel Hayes reviewed another page in his folder before briefly looking toward the clerk, whose expression had become noticeably more cautious. Even Michael Carter, who had entered the courtroom expecting a routine proceeding, now found himself studying Victoria with growing curiosity rather than the case documents before him. Judge Whitmore watched every movement without interruption. Her face revealed nothing, but she noticed Ryan's repeated comments, Victoria's unwavering composure, and the increasingly uncertain expressions spreading across the courtroom. She tapped her pen once against the bench before calmly asking the clerk to verify the complete list of submitted exhibits. The request sounded ordinary, yet it immediately prompted another round of quiet document exchanges. One courthouse employee entered through a side door carrying a sealed envelope marked for judicial review only. The envelope was placed beside the judge without explanation. Ryan barely glanced at it before dismissing it entirely. He believed the hearing remained centered on him. unaware that the attention of nearly everyone else had shifted somewhere he could not see. Victoria finally reached for a glass of water, taking one measured sip before placing it back exactly where it had been. Her movements reflected remarkable confidence without the slightest trace of arrogance. She never looked toward Ryan, never acknowledged his attempts to provoke her, and never interrupted the proceedings. That quiet restraint slowly began changing how people around the courtroom perceived her. A woman seated in the gallery leaned toward her husband and whispered, "She acts like she already knows something." He nodded without taking his eyes off the bench. Judge Whitmore opened the sealed envelope and silently examined its contents. Her expression remained composed, but she paused longer than before. Then she looked directly at Victoria for a brief moment that did not escape Emily Foster's attention. Emily circled one sentence in her notebook. "The judge knows exactly who she is." Ryan continued smiling, completely unaware that the assumptions carrying his confidence were beginning to crumble one unnoticed detail at a time, while the courtroom itself seemed to be quietly preparing for a revelation that would soon force every person inside to reconsider everything they believed when the morning first began. Judge Eleanor Whitmore placed the sealed envelope beside the case file without making any comment. Yet the simple gesture changed the mood more than any spoken instruction could have. The courtroom had become unusually quiet, the kind of silence that settled over people when they sensed they were witnessing the beginning of something they could not yet explain. Emily Foster noticed another courthouse employee enter through the rear door and quietly hand a small note to the clerk before leaving without speaking to anyone. The clerk read it once, folded it carefully, and slipped it beneath the existing paperwork instead of placing it on top. That tiny decision caught Emily's attention immediately. Experienced court staff never altered the order of documents unless instructed to do so. Daniel Hayes noticed it as well. He leaned slightly toward the clerk and asked a brief question in a voice too soft for anyone else to hear. The clerk answered with only a single nod. Hayes did not speak again. Instead, he closed one folder, opened another, and slowly removed several pages that had not been part of the original stack only minutes earlier. Across the room, Michael Carter watched the exchange with growing confusion. Whatever had just entered the courtroom clearly mattered, yet no one seemed willing to explain why. Ryan Mercer remained the only person completely untouched by the invisible current flowing through the room. He glanced toward the gallery and caught two spectators whispering to each other. Assuming they were talking about him, he offered a confident smile before turning back toward Victoria Brooks. "Still waiting for your miracle?" he asked with quiet sarcasm. Victoria met his direction for the first time that morning, but not with anger. Her eyes carried something far more unsettling. They reflected patience. It was the calm expression of someone who understood that truth never needed to rush because time always favored facts over assumptions. She offered no reply. Ryan laughed softly and looked away first without realizing he had done so. Judge Whitmore finally opened the envelope again and compared one document against the court docket. She carefully checked every page number before placing a small blue tab on a single sheet near the center. The action lasted less than 15 seconds, but everyone seated near the bench watched closely. Emily wrote another sentence in her notebook. "The judge is verifying identity, not evidence." That distinction immediately raised new questions. Identity verification rarely became the focus of a routine hearing unless someone's role inside the courtroom was far more significant than it first appeared. The gallery began filling with quiet speculation. One attorney from another courtroom stepped inside, looked toward the bench, and remained standing near the back instead of leaving after a quick glance. Moments later, another courthouse official entered, spoke briefly with the bailiff, and took a seat along the side wall. None of them appeared surprised to see Victoria. Instead, they seemed surprised that everyone else was treating her like an ordinary participant. Ryan never noticed the growing number of unfamiliar faces. His confidence continued to shield him from the details unfolding around him. He believed the hearing was moving exactly as expected because no one had openly challenged him. What he could not see was that the room itself had quietly stopped revolving around his testimony. Every exchanged glance, every carefully handled document, every measured pause from the judge was pointing toward a single truth still hidden beneath the surface. And while Ryan continued believing he was the most important person standing before the court that morning, Nearly everyone else had begun waiting for the moment when Victoria Brooks would finally be addressed the way she truly was. Ryan Mercer shifted his weight with growing impatience, convinced that every passing minute only delayed the inevitable conclusion he had already imagined. He glanced toward the courtroom clock before quietly exhaling through his nose, certain that the hearing had become unnecessarily complicated over paperwork that could not possibly matter. Around him, however, the atmosphere continued to change in ways he failed to recognize. Another courthouse official entered through the side door carrying a thin leather portfolio instead of the standard evidence box. The official walked directly to the clerk without hesitation, exchanged a few quiet words, and departed just as discreetly as he had arrived. The clerk immediately placed the portfolio beside the judge instead of sending it through the normal chain of review. Emily Foster noticed the unusual procedure and underlined another observation inside her notebook. Ordinary participants did not receive extraordinary handling. Daniel Hayes remained unusually reserved. He reviewed several pages before carefully removing one document from the middle of the stack and placing it on top. Michael Carter watched the movement and frowned. The order of documents inside a courtroom was rarely changed without purpose. Every adjustment suggested that someone had realized the hearing was no longer following the path originally expected. Victoria Brooks remained exactly as she had been since the morning began. Calm, attentive, patient. She neither interrupted nor reacted to the subtle changes unfolding around her. She simply observed with quiet confidence, as though every unexpected development was arriving precisely when it should. Ryan interpreted her composure as denial. He leaned back slightly and allowed himself another smile. Some people think staying quiet makes them look important, he remarked, just loud enough for several nearby spectators to hear. This time, no one laughed. Even the deputy standing closest to him kept his eyes fixed straight ahead. The absence of agreement lingered longer than the comment itself. Ryan noticed it, but quickly dismissed it. He had spent years believing confidence could replace careful observation, and that habit prevented him from seeing what everyone else was beginning to understand. Judge Eleanor Whitmore opened the leather portfolio and examined its contents with deliberate care. Her expression remained professional, yet there was unmistakable recognition in her eyes. She compared one document with the supplemental filing received earlier that morning, then quietly nodded to herself before placing both papers side by side. The courtroom waited. No announcement came. No explanation followed. The silence itself became part of the proceeding. Emily watched the judge's hands instead of her face. They moved with the certainty of someone confirming information already known rather than discovering something new. That realization sent another question through her mind. If the judge already knew who Victoria Brooks truly was, why had she allowed the hearing to continue this long? The answer seemed to be taking shape one careful step at a time. Facts were being arranged before identities were acknowledged. Procedure came before revelation. Across the gallery, conversations had completely stopped. Every eye now drifted toward Victoria whenever another document appeared. The quiet woman who had entered the courtroom unnoticed had somehow become the center of everyone's attention without saying more than a handful of words. Ryan remained the lone exception. He still believed appearances told the entire story. He never considered that genuine authority rarely announced itself through pride. It revealed itself through restraint, preparation, and the confidence to wait until every fact stood exactly where it belonged. Judge Whitmore finally closed the portfolio, rested one hand upon it, and looked directly toward Victoria once again. This time the look carried neither curiosity nor uncertainty. It carried unmistakable respect. Several people noticed it simultaneously, although none of them yet understood why. The mystery surrounding Victoria Brooks had grown far beyond simple speculation, and the courtroom could almost feel that the next words spoken from the bench would change not only how the hearing was remembered, but how every person inside that room understood the quiet woman they had underestimated from the very beginning. Judge Eleanor Whitmore slowly removed her reading glasses and placed them beside the neatly arranged files before looking across the courtroom with measured composure. Every conversation had faded into complete silence. Even the reporters who normally rushed to capture every detail had stopped writing, sensing that the next few moments carried unusual significance. Officer Ryan Mercer remained unaware of the shift. He stood comfortably, convinced that the proceeding had simply become delayed by administrative formalities. He glanced toward Victoria Brooks and allowed himself one final confident smile. In his mind, nothing had changed. He still believed she was an ordinary participant who had wandered into a courtroom far beyond her understanding. Judge Whitmore gently pressed the call button on the bench. The bailiff stepped forward immediately. "Please ensure the doors remain closed until the court grants permission to exit," the judge said calmly. There was no alarm in her voice. No urgency. Only careful procedure. The bailiff acknowledged the instruction, secured the courtroom doors, and returned to position. Several spectators exchanged puzzled looks. Emily Foster recognized the significance immediately. Restricted movement during a hearing was uncommon unless the court expected an important procedural development. She quietly underlined another sentence inside her notebook. "This is no longer an ordinary hearing." Daniel Hayes closed every folder except one. Michael Carter mirrored the action almost instinctively, as though both attorneys understood that everything discussed before this point had merely prepared the foundation for what would happen next. Ryan noticed the attorneys reorganizing their materials, but dismissed it as another unnecessary delay. "Looks like everybody finally found the right paperwork," he whispered with a quiet laugh. No one responded. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Victoria remained exactly as she had throughout the morning. Her posture never changed. Her breathing remained steady. She neither celebrated the shifting atmosphere nor showed satisfaction at Ryan's misplaced confidence. Instead, she watched Judge Whitmore with complete attention, as though both women understood an unspoken sequence that would unfold only when every procedural step had been completed correctly. Judge Whitmore reviewed one final page before looking toward the clerk. "Please verify the identity documentation attached to the supplemental filing." The clerk carefully examined the documents, compared several official seals, and nodded without hesitation. "Verified, Your Honor." The judge thanked the clerk with a brief nod before resting her fingertips lightly upon the file. Ryan frowned for the first time all morning. Identity verification had nothing to do with the testimony he expected to give. He looked toward Daniel Hayes, hoping for some explanation, but the prosecutor never lifted his eyes from the documents before him. Emily noticed that courthouse personnel who had entered only minutes earlier remained standing rather than leaving. They were not waiting for routine testimony. They were waiting for recognition. The realization sent a quiet ripple through the gallery. Spectators who had entered expecting an ordinary case now leaned forward with growing curiosity. Victoria finally drew a slow breath and folded her hands once again. There was still no trace of anxiety on her face, only calm certainty. Judge Whitmore looked directly toward her, her expression now carrying unmistakable respect that could no longer be mistaken for coincidence. The judge straightened the papers into a single stack, paused for one deliberate moment, and prepared to address the quiet woman before the bench in a manner that would forever change how every person inside that courtroom understood the events of that remarkable morning. Judge Eleanor Whitmore lifted her eyes from the file and allowed one final moment of silence to settle over the courtroom before speaking. Every person present instinctively leaned forward, sensing that the hearing had reached a turning point no one had anticipated. The judge's voice remained calm, measured, and unmistakably formal. "Before this court proceeds any further, the record must accurately reflect the identity of every individual participating in these proceedings." The court reporter nodded and adjusted the microphone. The clerk prepared a fresh page. Even the deputies standing along the wall seemed unusually attentive. Officer Ryan Mercer folded his arms with quiet confidence, assuming the statement was little more than another procedural requirement. He glanced toward Victoria Brooks and smiled as if the delay had become an inconvenience only for her. Judge Whitmore continued. "The court has completed verification of the supplemental documentation submitted this morning, along with the accompanying federal credentials and judicial notices." Those words immediately drew confused expressions from several spectators. Emily Foster stopped writing altogether. Federal credentials were not ordinary courtroom paperwork. Daniel Hayes closed his folder and quietly stood beside his table. Michael Carter followed a moment later. Ryan noticed both attorneys standing but remained seated where he was, still believing none of it concerned him. Then Judge Whitmore turned directly toward the quiet woman who had remained composed since the hearing began. Her voice softened, not with emotion, but with unmistakable respect. Director Victoria Brooks, would you please approach the bench? The words seemed to suspend time itself. No one moved. Ryan blinked once, convinced he had misunderstood what he had just heard. The gallery remained completely silent. Emily Foster stared at Victoria before quickly looking back at the judge, searching for any indication that she had misheard the title. There was none. The clerk immediately stood. The bailiff straightened his posture. Daniel Hayes lowered his head respectfully. Michael Carter stepped aside without being asked. Victoria slowly rose from her chair with the same calm dignity she had carried throughout the morning. There was no dramatic expression, no triumphant smile, no attempt to enjoy the surprise spreading across the courtroom. She simply buttoned her navy jacket, gathered a single folder from the table, and walked toward the bench with quiet confidence. Every step echoed softly across the marble floor. Ryan remained frozen. Only minutes earlier he had spoken to her, as though she were insignificant. Now every experienced professional inside the courtroom was treating her with unmistakable respect. His smile disappeared without him realizing it. Judge Whitmore offered a slight nod as Victoria approached. "Thank you for your patience, Director Brooks," she said. "The court appreciates your willingness to allow these proceedings to reach this point through proper procedure." Victoria answered with a calm voice that carried effortlessly through the silent room. "Thank you, Your Honor." It was the first complete sentence she had spoken all morning. The confidence in her voice did not come from arrogance. It came from someone who understood both the law and her responsibility within it. Emily finally wrote a single sentence across the top of a fresh page in her notebook. Everyone was watching the wrong person. Ryan slowly looked around the courtroom. For the first time that morning, he noticed something that had been there all along. No one was looking at him anymore. Every eye, every expression, every ounce of attention had shifted toward the woman he had dismissed before the hearing had even begun, and in that quiet realization, the certainty he had carried into the courtroom began to disappear, replaced by a single question he could no longer ignore. Who was Victoria Brooks, and why did everyone except him already seem to know the answer? Ryan Mercer felt the room slipping beyond his control long before anyone spoke another word. The confidence that had carried him through the morning no longer fit the moment. He watched as Director Victoria Brooks stood beside the bench with the quiet assurance of someone who belonged there, while Judge Eleanor Whitmore carefully opened the final section of the case file. No one hurried. Every movement reflected procedure rather than drama, making the silence even more powerful. Judge Whitmore looked toward the clerk. "Please enter the supplemental federal record into today's proceedings." "Yes, Your Honor." The clerk replied before marking the file and passing certified copies to both attorneys. Daniel Hayes accepted the documents with complete familiarity, while Michael Carter scanned the first page and slowly nodded, as though several unanswered questions had suddenly found their explanation. Ryan could no longer ignore the growing sense that everyone except him had understood the situation long before he did. Emily Foster watched Victoria with renewed curiosity. Years of reporting had taught her that genuine authority rarely announced itself through impressive introductions. Instead, it revealed itself through the respect shown by other professionals. Every person who handled the documents did so with unusual care. Every courthouse employee addressed Victoria with quiet professionalism. None of them appeared surprised by her title. Only Ryan seemed caught completely off guard. Judge Whitmore spoke again. "For the record, Director Brooks has appeared today under previously approved confidentiality procedures related to an ongoing federal review." A quiet murmur spread across the gallery before immediately fading as the bailiff reminded everyone to remain silent. Ryan stared at Victoria, trying to connect that statement with the woman he had spent the morning dismissing. The pieces refused to fit together. He remembered every sarcastic remark he had made, every assumption he had formed before learning a single fact about her. Those memories suddenly felt much heavier than they had only minutes earlier. Victoria remained composed. She neither celebrated nor criticized anyone. She simply waited while the legal process unfolded exactly as it had been designed to do. Judge Whitmore continued with calm precision. "The court has confirmed that several matters connected to today's hearing overlap with information already under authorized federal review. Accordingly, the supplemental record is now part of these proceedings." Daniel Hayes stood. "Your Honor, The government respectfully requests permission to reference the certified documentation. Granted, Judge Whitmore answered. Hayes opened the folder and spoke carefully. The documents establish that Director Brooks has supervised independent oversight involving multiple public integrity matters across several jurisdictions. Her presence today is directly connected to those authorized responsibilities. The statement landed with remarkable force despite its measured tone. No raised voices, no dramatic gestures, only verified facts placed on the official record. Emily quickly filled an entire page of notes. She realized the story had never been about a routine courtroom appearance. It had always been about perception, assumptions, and the quiet strength of someone willing to let the truth arrive through proper legal channels. Ryan lowered his eyes for the first time that morning. The room around him had not changed. The marble floor, the polished benches, the flags behind the bench, and the steady voice of the judge remained exactly the same. The only thing that had truly changed was his understanding. He had mistaken calm for weakness, silence for uncertainty, and dignity for insignificance. Now every certified document, every respectful greeting, and every procedural step revealed how completely he had misjudged the woman standing only a few feet away. As Judge Whitmore prepared to address the next phase of the hearing, there was no longer any doubt inside the courtroom. The truth had not arrived suddenly. It had been quietly present from the very beginning, waiting patiently for the moment when everyone would finally be ready to see it. Judge Eleanor Whitmore allowed the final certified document to rest upon the bench before looking across the courtroom one last time. The silence no longer carried uncertainty. It carried understanding. Every person present had watched assumptions slowly give way to verified facts, and there was nothing left to speculate about. The court had spoken through procedure, documentation, and respect for the law. Judge Whitmore addressed the room with calm authority. The integrity of this court depends upon treating every individual with equal dignity before any conclusion is reached. Today's proceedings have demonstrated why that principle exists. Her words settled over the courtroom with quiet weight. No one interrupted. Daniel Hayes carefully closed his file. Michael Carter did the same. The clerk completed the final entries for the official record while the court reporter finished typing the last statements. Director Victoria Brooks remained beside the bench exactly as she had conducted herself throughout the hearing, composed, respectful, and focused entirely on the process rather than on personal recognition. Judge Whitmore turned toward her. Director Brooks, this court appreciates your professionalism and your commitment to allowing the legal process to unfold without unnecessary interference. Victoria answered with a slight nod. Thank you, Your Honor. Justice has the strongest voice when every person is given the opportunity to hear the facts before reaching a conclusion. There was no celebration in her tone, only quiet conviction. Those words lingered throughout the courtroom far longer than anyone expected. Ryan Mercer stood motionless. Earlier that morning, he had measured people by appearance, confidence, and his own assumptions. Now he understood how incomplete those judgments had been. The realization arrived without anyone humiliating him, without raised voices, and without anyone seeking revenge. The truth itself had been enough. He slowly lowered his head before speaking in a voice far different from the one he had carried into the courtroom. Your Honor, Director Brooks. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I allowed my assumptions to speak before I understood the facts. That was my mistake. The courtroom remained silent. Victoria looked toward him with the same calm expression she had shown from the very beginning. She did not respond with anger or satisfaction. Instead, she simply acknowledged his words with a respectful nod. Sometimes accountability began not with punishment, but with the willingness to recognize one's own errors. Emily Foster quietly closed her notebook. She had arrived expecting to cover another routine hearing. Instead, she had witnessed something far more meaningful. The story was never about a surprising title or an unexpected position. It was about the danger of deciding who someone is before learning the truth. As spectators quietly filed toward the exit after the court adjourned, conversations remained unusually thoughtful. People who had entered with certainty now left with questions about their own first impressions. Judge Whitmore stepped down from the bench and briefly exchanged a professional handshake with Director Brooks before both women departed through separate doors, each returning to the responsibilities waiting beyond the courtroom. Ryan remained standing for another moment, watching the nearly empty room. The polished marble floor looked exactly as it had that morning. The flags behind the bench had never moved. The law itself had not changed. What had changed was the understanding of everyone who had witnessed the proceedings. Respect could never be demanded through authority alone. It had to be earned through character, integrity, and truth. And as the courtroom lights reflected across the now quiet benches, one lesson remained stronger than every assumption that had filled the room only hours earlier. A badge may introduce a person, but only character reveals who they truly are, and truth will always speak louder than prejudice when justice is finally given the chance to be heard.